three things. Number one, trust, vulnerability, and what was the other one?
Trust and vulnerability were the two big ones.
Trust
That's
and
for sure.
vulnerability. Right. And so what we thought about today is we talk about those. So not only what are some tips of how to get better at it, but also what we're sensing, what we're hearing out there in the marketplace about it. So the first question I wanted to throw out to you guys is, are trust and vulnerability teachable? Mark, you want to
Well,
take?
and Chip, sure. And before we get too far in, let's, let everybody know that, we are on Facebook Live, we're on the Zoom here, but if people have questions, right, we're open to questions. We're going to chat about things we've thought about a little bit and have come up, but for those that are with us, either out in the Facebook world or have joined us here in the Zoom, please, send questions in. We've got somebody monitoring the Facebook Live. We'll feed those over, but we want to answer any of your questions that you might have out here and as we go along today in this hour together. Going to your question, Chip, and the thing we talked about are trust and vulnerability teachable. I absolutely think they are. I think they're like anything else. I think they're muscles that when they're not used, they atrophy. And when we start to use them, they feel really weird and awkward. And quite frankly, we give up on them quickly. It's kind of like working out, right? When you first go to the gym or you go back to the gym, you're like, wow, this is hard. And it feels weird and feels odd. And I think that trust and vulnerability are like that. And I think that, we'll get Janelle joining us. I think that the more that we can, as leaders and organizations, work with these ideas of trust and vulnerability and some of the things we'll talk about today and introduce them and support them and encourage them, I think they become learned habits that people can form over time and get stronger and better at.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I certainly think they are teachable. I also think it's up to that person, right? So you can't make somebody do something. If somebody wants to become more trustworthy and somebody wants to become more vulnerable, you have to practice it. And so, I think you have to figure out why you want to be those things and then surround yourself with a group of people that will help you be more trustworthy, help you be more vulnerable. And then also going back to you have to practice. So the more that you practice those two things, the better you're going to get at it.
Yeah. And I would add on to both of those things. To me, there's one step that I don't think is teachable, and it's that first step. It's much to me like swimming. You have to have courage in the beginning in order to get over that threshold of becoming trustworthy or becoming more vulnerable. There's that step that's on you, and you have to use that. You have to find the courage. And I often see people going, well, I just want them to trust me. How do I do that?
Well, and I think I want to riff off that a little bit, if I can, Chip, and say that I actually think it's really about risk, right? Mm-hmm. You have to be willing to risk and put yourself out there, right? Brene Brown says that you cannot have courage without vulnerability. It does not exist. Think about any situation. This is, if you've never seen her stuff, go watch the TED Talk, go see any of her stuff. Awesome. But she says in all of her studies and all the things she's done, hundreds of thousands of interviews and data points, not one time has she ever been able to find a courageous moment or a person that was labeled as courageous who was not vulnerable. And that really is what it comes down to. Vulnerability doesn't mean that you just show up and say everything and you just speak everything out loud that's in your mind. That's not vulnerability. Yeah. Right? Vulnerability has thought process and all that, but
it does. And
being
Mark,
courageous is about that.
Something that she says, which really stood out to me, was the phrase of acts of courage are impossible without putting yourself in a vulnerable state. And that's hard for people to do, right? Because when you're in that state, it's an emotion that we all feel, and we begin to feel that when we feel exposed or when we're in places of risk or when we're in places, of uncertainty, when we're opening up to being judged by others. And that's an extremely hard thing to do and a hard place to get to.
Absolutely.
It is, but it goes back to what Chip was saying, right? Too, it's just you have to be willing to risk.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
You have
You have to be
the courage
willing to
do that.
risk that.
Mhm.
But yeah, the first step is on you. Then the whole everything as it relates to vulnerability and trust opens up to you, and there are ways to get better at it. There are ways to learn how to converse in a setting that's going to gain you more trust, and therefore that trust will be reciprocated from the people you're working with. There are ways to be vulnerable without going overboard and fully exposing yourself
Mhm.
to all the emotions of that, but you just have to be willing to take and assume that risk and go there. And once you do, and once the people around you, especially if you're a leader, if you're a CEO, these are critical things that you have to demonstrate. You can't ask your team to do this. You can't ask them to trust you. You can't ask them to be vulnerable with you. You have to demonstrate it first and lead them down that path, and then they will hitch onto that and behave in the ways that you have taught them to do so, and
Yeah,
therefore it
and
will then blossom.
and we know that firsthand. When we're in planning sessions and when we're, leading a group through different activities, say Wheel of Life, for example, or Lifeline, for example, a couple things that you could do, activities to encourage trust and vulnerability with your group. The more open you are when you're standing up there leading those things, the rest of the group, they will reciprocate that. So it
Mhm.
absolutely starts with you as the leader.
Yep. So good stuff so far. Let's move on to another question. And for those of you who have joined us, if you have any questions, you're welcome to put them in the chat. If you're over with us on Facebook, we're monitoring that as well. Put it in the comments there, and we'll certainly get to it. So I want to kind of piggyback on this and ask this question. Why is vulnerability seen as a weakness?
Ooh, that's that's a good question. I'll jump in to start with that, and we kind of touched on this a second ago. I think vulnerability is seen as a weakness because, again, you're opening, yourself up to potentially, being judged by other people, and in some form or fashion. I mean, nobody wants that rejection. Nobody wants to be judged by other people. I think we all strive for perfection, and which that's almost an exhausting behavior there within itself. And I think you'll find that people who seek perfection, they're also seeking approval. But going back to that being seen as a weakness, I think it comes from opening yourself up to let people in, to let people see your mistakes, to let people see things that you probably already know, which, they're mistakes and things that you could have done better.
Yeah. Mark, anything to add?
Yeah, I think that I think it's seen as a weakness more from the perspective of, it's a relative perspective, right? What I mean by this is, I think, I'll use myself as the example. I think others see it as a weakness. I don't know that the reality is that they really see it as a weakness, right? I've just got this perception in my mind. And I think some of this comes from, I'll take this all the way back. When we were all young kids, right? I've got a 3-year-old home, so I get to deal with this a little bit. Young kids are incredibly vulnerable. They'll say anything, do anything, and they don't get, they're like, woohoo, the world's my oyster. And I think, through lots of lessons, they learn that, I need to check that, right? I need to, be tempered a little bit. They don't understand it, though. They don't have, when kids are younger, they don't have the cognitive ability to understand why somebody might have reacted. Maybe it's their issue, not, mine. And so we start to learn this thing of, I'm being judged, or I think they're thinking negative things of me or whatever. And it's not really the case, but we get in that pattern. And then as we get older, we just follow the pattern that we learned a long time ago.
Hmm.
And so I think that idea of, why is it seen as a weakness? I think it's more in our own head. we think it's a weakness from the things we learned and the patterns that we've had. And I would, challenge leaders, right? Go, figure out if that's your reality. Do people really see it as a weakness, or do they see it as you being a true leader? And I think, again, repeat it probably a lot in this hour, but Brene Brown would argue, demonstrably, that leadership is about being vulnerable, not the lack of vulnerability. And there's a great saying, I was writing it down. We like to have Post-its, right? But, this saying that, discomfort is the price of a meaningful life. Well, you know what, go through that discomfort of thinking, that people see it as weakness, work through that, and know that as a leader, we're leading a meaningful life by challenging that, moving forward, and still, sitting with and dealing with it.
Yeah. So we have something. Oh, Chip, what you got?
Go ahead, Catherine.
Well, I was just going to read what was in the chat box here. So something that somebody put in was, in my opinion, vulnerability also coincides with being emotional, which I think often is seen as a weakness. So I think that's a different perspective to have on that. And you're right. I think being seen as emotional is being seen as a weakness. And I think we as people, it's our natural tendency that, when we begin to feel vulnerable or feel emotional, we build up those walls, or our gut reaction is to, oh, I don't want to feel like this. So I do agree with that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what's happened is the extremes of vulnerability have tainted the perception of what it really is. We see it all the time when we're in plannings and we're having some heavy conversations, and somebody might tear up or get choked up or something like that. And I see that is an absolute strength, because the courage it takes to do that in front of your peers, those are much stronger people than you realize. But I also believe that there's a lot of subtlety and nuance as it relates to vulnerability that we forget about too. And that is, instead of, you think about those leaders that we love to be led by, they're not hypercritical of people. It's the vulnerability is in the way we phrase our questions. It's in the way we give feedback. It's in the way that we call out things that we see within the behaviors of our walls that don't represent who we are. And I think that is an absolute side of vulnerability that gets missed too. Because what we're seeing a lot of now is, because we're dealing with a lot of remote people in the workforce and in your businesses out there, how do you say something, right? Everyone's very sensitive right now, but how do you say the things that need to correct those behaviors?
Yeah.
And being vulnerable, actually, I think, is the best way to go about doing that. It's not calling out, you're saying you're an idiot for doing it that way. What are you talking about? But hey, I don't understand why you made that decision. Can you help me understand that so I can better get it? That's a form of being vulnerable.
Mm-hmm. I love that point. Mark, I cut you off, but I was listening to a podcast the other day, and it was somewhat around this topic, mostly around communication. And what they were saying was, we communicate with each other in two types of ways. We either nourish something, or it's a toxic way to communicate with one another. And they gave pretty much that exact example of, if you submitted a project to your leader and they barged through your door and they said, hey, this is terrible, it's junk, why did you send this to me? Right? You're immediately shut down, closed off. You are not going to go to that person and open up to them because of that reaction. But if that leader had come in and said, hey, one, I appreciate you for doing this. I think there could be some improvements. Can we sit down and talk about it? You're going to get two completely different reactions, and you're accomplishing the exact same goal, but it's all in how you present that to the person.
And that's a great segue, Catherine, into the next question I had. Did you have something to add, Mark?
Mark.
You both cut me off. It's fine. Everybody else out here in Facebook world and Zoom world sees how we all interact every day.
Exactly.
yeah, what I was going to add was, kind of from both of your points, I thoroughly agree. And it really is about, showing that curiosity from a leadership's perspective, right? I think that, Catherine, as you were saying, and as the chat said, it may be seen as emotions, right? Emotional. So, right. I think the reality is we all have emotions, right? To think that we can be automatons and robots and, that's crazy,
Yeah.
right? We're human beings, right? We have emotions. So as leaders, for us to tell people to ignore the emotion, just get over it, right? Has anyone ever gotten over something because somebody said, just get over it? It never has solved the issue.
It usually makes it worse.
I was about to
It
say, the
does.
worst thing you
Well,
can do to tell somebody is to tell them to calm
right.
down.
I mean, what's it going to do? It's either going to, they may calm down by shutting down, which is, as leaders, most often what every leader says is, why don't my people talk to me? Why don't they tell me the truth? Why am I hearing this when it gets to be a huge dumpster fire instead of when it's a little issue? Well, if you're telling them to get over it, and essentially if they come with emotions and they show up and you shut them down, you're teaching your team how to act. Right? Now, does it mean that we should all be just, blabbering idiots, if you will, on every little thing? No. But that doesn't mean we can't support it, right? As leaders, we also don't know what's behind it. Isn't it better to be curious and say, you know what, something like, it seems like this is challenging. Chip, I loved your lines. It seems like this is challenging. Could you help me to understand? Is a lot different than, why the hell are you doing that? Or, get over it.
Yeah.
So it's, a lot of this, the other last piece I'll throw in on this is that more often than not, we do that. I'll use myself. I do that because I'm uncomfortable with the situation and I want to move past it faster, right? Why don't you just get over that? Because I don't want to deal with this, right? Once again, a well-led life is getting through the discomfort. So I need to, as the leader, go, oh, this is something I'm uncomfortable with. Why is that? Maybe I need to understand more, and I need to understand the situation more.
Yeah. So a couple of points to that, and then Chip, we'll get to the other question that you had. So I think it's very important, that leaders spend a significant amount of time with their direct supports, learning about their fears, learning about their feelings, learning about why they are the way that they are. And, Mark, to your point, stepping into that place, it is uncomfortable. A lot of times we sidestep clarity, we sidestep conversations, going back to Brene Brown here, because we think that's the kind thing to do, when in reality it's not. Clear is kind, unclear is unkind, because later on down the road, when your direct support screws up and you're mad at them, really what it comes back to is you should be upset with yourself because you didn't have the courage to have that hard conversation with them.
Yeah, we see it all the time. The downline impact of those very scenarios are the things that lead to separations. And if we are vulnerable, if we have the courage to deal with those instances one at a time, they're little teeny tiny things. They're minute corrections. So here's the next thing, and I want to piggyback on what you said, Catherine, and that is, what's the difference between criticism and feedback, and what's the impact of both?
Mark, you want to start us out with this one?
No, I thought he said it was coming. Yeah. Now you don't cut me off and I'm waiting, right? Right. Yeah, I think that, I'm sure if we go look up the definition of criticism and feedback, I don't know them off the top of my head, so I'm sure someone will tell me I did it wrong, and it's fine. I think that from my perspective, really the difference between criticism and feedback really comes into what outcome are you expecting, right? I think when feedback is in a format where it's, it's well thought out as to what the objective is, right? I'm giving this feedback, and I don't remember all the steps, maybe one of you remember it, but, saying something, you shouldn't just say what's on the top of your mind. You should think through, is this, important to say now, right? Is it important for me to say it, right? And there's one other step to it, but it's kind of that idea of, I think feedback is about the right things at the right time so that we can get a better outcome or learn something new, right? It seems like things are not getting done on this priority. I'm attempting to understand, can you help me? That's feedback versus criticism is, why the hell didn't you get this done? Or you're in the red. Why? Right? I think there's, the difference is what outcome are you expecting out of it? My
Yeah.
2 cents.
I like that. I like that a lot. And, to that point, timing is everything, right?
Yeah.
So timing is everything. And I completely agree with, what outcome are you looking for? So to me, a healthy drive for success is asking the question, how can I improve this? If you want to help your employees, the people who you're supporting, get better, you have to learn the difference. You have to know how to position those questions. So you come from a place of curiosity. How can we make this 2% better? I think I found some ways we can improve this. What do you think? Help me understand this. And I might have just said that, but going at it from an angle of curiosity versus coming from an angle of, hey, that's terrible. Why did you send that project to me? It's incomplete. You're accomplishing the exact same goal, but you're coming at it from 2 completely different directions.
I like to explain it this way, and that is criticism is about telling something they did it wrong, telling someone they did it wrong, and feedback is telling them something that they did right and in a way that they could be more right or more correct. But I also see there's a very fine line between the two. Most of us, I know, based on my childhood and rearing, and I got a lot of criticism. It wasn't a lot of feedback, right?
Yeah.
Don't put your hand on the stove. Stop it. Dealing that with I've got a 12-week-old puppy in the house right now, and so there's a lot of criticism there. But it also goes to the intent, and I think that phrase we all know and love, assume positive intent, is rooted in what feedback is about. And one of the methods that we teach in how to give proper feedback is you actually ask the recipient first. Is it okay if I give you some feedback? And an amazing thing happens. Difficult conversations get a little bit simpler when they give you permission. And we honor that permission. And if they say, no, not right now, but could we have that conversation maybe tomorrow? You respect it, but you still have it. And it helps temper it, because when we go into criticism mode, the recipient of that person actually puts up armor. They go into fight or flight mode within their brain, as opposed to those who are taking feedback, which engages the learning side of the mind. So it's an interesting, there's an interesting psychological effect, but from the two, and it is a fine line, but it is a profound line as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, and it went up in the Zoom chat on the definitions. And if you look at it, right, criticism is the expression of disapproval, right, of something that's perceived to have been a fault or mistake. Right, there's disapproval, fault, and mistake. Boy, there's some negative comments in there, right? There's, and Chip, you talk about, you might not have had a lot of feedback when you were a kid. And again, I go back to what I mentioned earlier: is as human beings, one of the things we do is we learn from patterns. That's what we're able to do. That's not a bad thing. We survived to this point, but those patterns may not serve us going forward. And if you see yourself as a leader, as setting the tone for the next, generation of leadership in your company, or as they go on, if you set that tone of criticism, guess what? The next management team is going to criticize. That's what they learned. And, again, we have to break those cycles at certain points and show that different patterns can serve us better now. And how do we do that? There's where, again, vulnerability and courage comes in.
Yeah. And so, Chip, to pretty much repeat, what you just said, is you have to disarm somebody, right? So if you come to them and you start to criticize them or tell them the mistakes they made, they're going to put those walls up. So if you come to them, disarm them by asking the question, hey, is this a good time for us to talk about this? Or are you open to getting some feedback right now? Again, you're going to have a much more productive conversation. And also asking people how they want to receive feedback. Some people want to receive it right there in the moment. Other people want to process, digest, and then talk about it. So I think knowing how your team likes to receive feedback is also important.
Absolutely. And it's a great way for you as a leader to go back to being vulnerable and say, look, let me know how you want to receive these kinds of and these bits of information so that we can use this as an improvement and not as a barrier to our continued relationship.
Yeah. Yep. You have to shift your mindset for sure, because it's not something that comes natural to people.
I think too that, when you look at it, right, I don't think there's many, I won't say any, but I don't think there's many leaders or founders or entrepreneurs, right, put it in whatever category, CEOs that say, yeah, you know what, I want to be a super critical, I want to be known as a super critical person, right, as a super critical woman or man who's leading this organization. Nobody says that.
Yeah.
I think part of it is taking the cues from the organization, right? I go back to my, why aren't people giving feedback? Well, that might be because they're not receiving feedback, right? They're not receiving input that allows them to feel comfortable to do the same in return. So I would say as a leader, if what you're seeing is, you're not getting a lot of feedback, you're feeling like you have to do all these things, you're carrying all the load, right? Then you might be getting a clue in a subtle way that the organization isn't receiving from the top down, going to what you said, Catherine, right? That comes from the top down. The organization might not be receiving the right signals.
Yeah.
And take a long look in the mirror. It isn't always easy, but if we want different outcomes, we have to do different things.
Of course.
Very much so.
So when you guys encounter this in your coaching, what are some of the tools that you use? Someone, a member, we call our clients members of our organization. When a member comes to you, a leader, CEO, management, whatever, says, hey, I'm having a problem with this, with vulnerability or with feedback, or whatever. What are some of the tools? How do you coach them through that, Mark?
Well, I think this would be a great one. I know we have it. Thanks, Chip, for sending it over that way. So we cut off Catherine. Just kidding. But this might be a good segue a little bit to you want to flash up on the screen there the thing that we had thrown together that we use a lot in our sessions is we have this thing called the adult agreement, right? And this is one way to help teach that, I think, Chip, is to talk about how do we, I've got a classic definition of disappointment, right? My definition of disappointment is when expectation doesn't meet reality. The zone between expectation and reality is disappointment. And I think if you have something like this, right? So this is a teachable thing. You can have something where you say, hey, you know what? This is an adult agreement. This is saying how we're going to act with one another, right? And you go through here and you say, as an adult agreement, we agree we're all going to be adults, right? We're here for the same reason. We act like adults. Here's the do's and do nots, right? And you talk about these things and say, with this person who's asking, Chip, right? Okay, one of the things I love when we do this, I don't know about you two, is I have people circle, what do you think you do really well in the adult agreement? What's an area for improvement or an opportunity for improvement? And so if a leader asks me, hey, I'm not being challenged with this, being vulnerable and all this is a great place to start. What area are you struggling in a little bit of being what we consider to be adult? It's one approach. So, Catherine, you have a thought?
Yeah. So I'm going to stop sharing this. Chip, do you have any thoughts on this?
Oh, I could go on all day about these.
All day long. All right. Well, I'll leave it up, but I'll hop in and then you can talk about it. So I think a different angle to that, and we have different activities that we do with our members to help encourage this. But I also think just getting to know your employees and getting to know your team. It kind of goes back to leaders spending time with their team and learning, their fears and really what their feelings are, what makes them tick, why they are the way that they are, or, our behaviors stem from something. And all of those things, have made us who we are. And so to sit back and open up and, to take a look at how far this person's come. We do activities like a lifeline, for example, which that's diving in real deep, real fast. But I know a lot of people do it, especially in forums, and it works really well. I mean, you get to the heart of somebody and know who they are after that, or will of life. So that's something, that we like to do with our members on an annual basis. And so you look at the different areas of your life, what's going really well, what do you need to work on, are a couple of other things that you could do to help, encourage or foster that vulnerability and also that trust between one another. Chippy?
And I would just add there, as it relates to this, we just had a question come in. But just real quick on this adult agreement, I've actually taken this and we've spent a significant amount of time on this in a planning session, and I will have the people in the session actually grade themselves against each sentence, not just the whole thing, but each sentence one-on-one, and you'd be amazing how deep that you can get with that. And so it's a really powerful tool, and you can go on and take that off. But the other thing I'll add, and I had a session with a member last week who was having some issues with vulnerability and trust. And so we did what I call a 360-degree start, stop, keep with everybody. We had 6 people in the planning session, and we went around the room and everybody wrote out a separate start, stop, keep for each person. And then they delivered it to them in front of the entire team. So the vulnerability that everyone had to go through, and the trust that they all had to demonstrate, led to an amazingly impactful piece of that planning session, where everyone had to go through and say, what was one thing that you need to start doing? What is one thing you need to keep doing? And what is one thing you need to stop doing? And hearing it from everyone on the team, and it was my job to make sure that we had the right tone and the parameters for doing that were set, and when they knew what the rules were and weren't, and the outcome was amazing.
I think so, Chip. I'll say this, and then we'll jump to this question in the chat box. That's an awesome activity to do. I think it's very, very important, which I know that you did this, is stress that what happens in this room stays in this room. And once we leave the room, we're not then going to go and talk about it. As we say, water cooler talk, to your buddy about, oh, well, he said this or she said this about me, and you get mad about it, right? So you have to be willing to accept that feedback that other people are giving you, and also look for patterns in the feedback that you're getting. So if it's a one-off thing, that's somebody's, opinion, that's their perspective, but look for those patterns in the feedback you're getting and hone in on those areas. So the question that is in
before we go to that, let me 2 seconds here, is I do think that this is one of those where if as a leader, the idea of doing a 360 feedback like that, right? If that scares the crap out of you, I would challenge you that you probably need to do it more than you think you do. Because I will tell you that I've worked with leaders when, that are more kind of feedback oriented, more kind of vulnerable, and, engaged. And when we bring this idea up, they're like, oh, heck yes, right? Because it's feedback that they're getting, right? Versus criticism. We talked about it before, right? If you think that you're going to do this and get criticized in that process, there's something that you need to work on as an organization, as a leader, as a leadership team. Just by the reaction that you have to the thought of doing it will give you a clue. And I think it relates to the question. So go ahead with the question, Catherine, that we've got on here.
In our chat box. So the question is, what if someone takes a look in the mirror and doesn't like what they see, but they don't know how to change?
Chip, what do you think?
That's a great question. And Look, and actually, when it hits home, because when I'm talking to people about what we do as coaches, I tell them this all the time, that when I am at my best, I am doing nothing but holding up a mirror and asking you the question, do you like what you see? Because I think figuratively, that is what we all do as coaches. And so for you, Andrea, thank you for sending that in. I think the first thing is, don't look at the immediacy of where you are. You'll get stuck in a rut, attempting to get out of that. But if you can, find a way to think about yourself in 5 or 10 years from now, and what you want that version of you to be. Because when we can define a future, a perfect state for us, then the road to getting there becomes much simpler to see, and we're able to work on it in an incremental fashion. So don't start with the first step of the trip. Define the destination first, and then work backwards.
I think that's great advice. That's great advice.
And if
I think
we can help you on
I,
that, Andrea, please just reach out, and we'll be glad to spend some one-on-one time with you if you'd like. Sorry,
yes,
Mark.
we would. Very happy to. I think I want to take from on the question, right? If you don't like what you see, but don't know how to change, I think the first step in anything is realizing that you don't know, right? And again, I go back to being curious. It's like, I don't like it, or I have this sense that it isn't where I'd like to be, and I need help. You know what? I think that's a huge thing. We're talking about courage and vulnerability, is saying, you know what? I think one Achilles heel, especially of entrepreneurs. I've worked throughout my career with folks in the entrepreneurs organization, so earlier stage businesses. We also work with big businesses, so it's not just that. But I think one of the Achilles heels that we have as leaders is that we feel we always have to have the answer and be right, and everybody's always looking to us to do that. And so I think some of it is, to answer Andrea's question here, is, if you don't like what you see, realize that, and then search for resources for other places. Get a coach, right? Whether it's somebody at Petra Coach, somebody else, I don't care, get a coach. There is no, a little bit of a tangent, but there is no professional, right, in the world. You can talk about, in an orchestra, a sports athlete, whatever it is, there is no professional that doesn't have a coach. Mm-hmm. Why in business do we think that having a coach is this negative thing, right? Or a counselor or a therapist. You know what? We don't all have the answers. And the longer we think we have all the answers, the worse it's going to get, the worse that look in the mirror is. So, be willing to, you're in a mirror, be real. And then say, what are some of the options, and reach out to others, reach out to, peers that you have that, you say, hey, has anybody worked with anybody? I don't know how to approach this. Because you're right, Chip. I don't think it's looking at, because if you think about all the steps that it might take, that'd be very daunting. But if it's a willingness to see, the things you don't like, and then to reach out and ask questions and be curious, I think there are lots of resources out there, whether they be coaches, whether they be, books, whether they be conferences that you can go to. There's lots of resources. So, be willing to see it first and then reach out.
Well,
and real quickly on the topic of books, this is a book I would highly recommend, because my experience with this is the change is more about how do we bring on new habits. Mm-hmm. And this book, Mini Habits by Stephen Geis, it's a simple read. This is like a 2-cup of coffee book. There's some great things in here about how to figure out what the catalyst or your threshold is, and how to step over that and not the end result. So just this little quick something there.
And so I think too, if you look in the mirror, you don't like what you see, you don't know how to change. I think you need to give yourself, some gratitude for just recognizing, for being self-aware that there are things inside of you that you do, either need to change or you want to change. So, pat yourself on the back for that. And then, I'm going to go to 2 spots here, something that's already been said in both areas. But, when you put a puzzle together, what's the first thing you do? you look at the box, right? So you have to know where you're going. And then you figure out, how am I going to get there? And so that goes back to, you've figured out the things that you want to change, or that you want to change. And I also think finding a group of people that will help you get there is very, very important. I'll use an example of, say physical therapy. Say you've broken a bone or something, right? If you were going to fix yourself, I'll use me as an example. I would, I'll lay on the couch, I'll let this thing heal, it'll be fine. Not a freaking chance. You're going to go to physical therapy and you're going to have these doctors that work with you. You're not going to like it. It's probably going to hurt, but that's what they're there for. And so find a group of people that will help you get to where you want to go, and know that it's not going to be easy, but keep reminding yourself of who you want to be in 3 to 5 years, and know that all of that back and forth, all that painful stuff, it will certainly pay off for you in the long run.
I've seen Catherine go through physical therapy. So she and I coached
Not fun.
a physical therapy company down in New Orleans, and we were down there to visit, but we got in a little bit early and went to one of the offices, and she was in like serious hip pain.
So
I'm like,
bad. So
hey,
bad.
maybe these people know a little more about how to deal
Be
with.
vulnerable, Catherine. Be vulnerable. Come on now.
And they got her up on a table and started stretching her out and working things over. And if anyone from Magnolia Physical Therapy is watching, say hello. But they did magic in a matter of about a half hour. The pain she'd been dealing with for weeks was gone.
Yep. Exactly.
Well, and I think that it relates, right? Is that, and I say this often when working with the members, is that, growth is on the other side of adversity. The challenge is you must go through adversity to get to the growth. You cannot stop in front of it. You cannot go under it, around it, over it. It is impossible. Just like in that example with Catherine going to physical therapy, you can't get better if you're not willing to put in a little bit of effort and pain. That's the reality. Anybody who really believes that good things happen just because, yes, sometimes things all line up, but I would tell you that there's probably a lot of pain in the background. You just didn't see it or remember it.
Yeah.
But you have to go through that adversity to get to that growth, and to, we have a visual that says the magic is outside your comfort zone. It's outside of feeling comfortable.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yep.
So to somewhat flip the coin, I think some things that you could do to encourage trust, encourage, vulnerability, encourage your team to come to you. How do you help them get better? I think you as a leader, you need to be a few different things. And one is you have to be reliable, right? So you have to do what you say you're going to do. And you have to almost be like a vault, right? So when people come to you, they know and they trust that whatever conversation the two of you have, it's not going to go anywhere outside of that room or outside of that conversation. So, you put it in that box, you put a lock on it, and that's as far as it goes. Going back to, we've talked about, being non-judgmental, right? So when somebody comes to you with something, we as human beings, we're already forming these thoughts in our heads, or the comments that we want to say back, the critiques, the criticism, the feedback, whatever it is, we're already forming that as that person is still talking to us. So practice, of course, staying calm, but also keeping your mind quiet, which takes practice within itself. But then also just being, showing empathy towards that person, understand where they're coming from, appreciate how far that they've come. And I think by doing those things, along with others, of course, will help, initiate some of those conversations, and also will help people feel more comfortable coming to you with issues that they're having.
Thank you.
I think one of the things that you mentioned there, right, having empathy, I think is important. I want to also add to that. I think it's a combination, or you can choose one, but it's compassion too, right? Compassion is being able to have an understanding. You don't have to have been in the situation, right? I don't have to have the same experience that Catherine had, but I can be compassionate for, the challenges that she might be going through or somebody might be going through. And I can hold that, all right, as a leader, we need to get certain things done, right? So, okay, I'm not going to allow somebody not to keep missing their objectives, right? Whatever it is. So we set some priorities, we need to get those done. If someone continually is missing them, I can still be compassionate for why that might be, yet also be a leader and say, we had a reason for wanting to get this done, right? How do we marry these two things, right? Is this just too much for one person to do? Is it too much for you, whoever it may be, right? Given the certain circumstances, let's get you some help, right? Let's do this in a different way, approach it in a different way. I think that empathy and compassion, from a leadership perspective, doesn't mean that you abdicate the guidance that you have to set and the boundaries that are required to move the organization or the product or the service forward.
And along those lines, this is one from Tom from Iowa. It says, if I can't be, he said, I can't be vulnerable with my employees because I think they take advantage of me. So how would you coach him to maybe look at that a little bit differently? We'll start with Catherine.
So the first question that I would have for Tom is, do you have the right people on your team? Do those people line up with the core values that you have or the core purpose that your organization has? And also, if you think somebody's going to take advantage of you, again, all of our behaviors, all of our thoughts are things, right? And they all stem from something. And so I would first ask, the question, do you have the right people on your team? But also sit down with Tom and work to figure out why you think they would take advantage of you.
Mm-hmm.
Mark?
Yeah, I think I totally agree with you, Catherine, is, do you have the right people, on the team if they are going to take advantage of you, right? Have we, to your point, have we hired and brought people in through a process of matching them up to the values of the organization? Because I oftentimes find that when people do the job, right, they complete the work, right, the to-do or task list, whatever it is, but they still don't fit. They rub you the wrong way. They do things that, don't align. That's a values mismatch on what the organization's values are and what theirs are. And I guess what I would say to Tom is, let's look at what our hiring process is and what the feedback loop is to these people, right? Because, I mentioned it before, is if the feedback you're getting is we're going to take advantage of you at every opportunity we can, I might argue that the organization has communicated that that's organizationally what's okay, at least, if not expected. So how do we take a look at organizationally, what are we doing? And are we cultivating that, environment of taking advantage of people, right? I don't think I've ever had an organization where a core value was we take advantage of everybody at every point that we can. So, that being the case, you might not have an altruistic one, but is there something as an organization we say, hey, you know what, go back to that adult agreement. We don't shoot each other down, right? Let's pull it back to, all right, maybe we need to introduce the adult agreement to the organization before you go out and do a little bit more vulnerability work and all of that. Okay, great. Let's lay the right groundwork. But I think I'd look at it from all angles for you, Tom, and say, again, how can we adapt what the organization is doing so that others don't then take advantage of us at every point? At least a thought.
And I might go a different direction, and I'd have a hard conversation with Tom because maybe he's the problem. Yeah. If Tom is fearful of being vulnerable, and therefore what we're really dealing with is that Tom is projecting an air of not wanting to be vulnerable because he thinks they might take advantage of him. That's what we really need to understand, because maybe something in Tom's past that's blocking him and blocking his skills that he needs to learn and evolve as a leader in an organization today. And so it oftentimes, when I deal with this, it is coming from a perspective of fear in the individual. And so how can we get them over that? And it very well,
and I think
also,
I think too that we can. One thing I like to do when I do this, Tom, this is an idea. It's like okay, what's the worst thing that could happen if they took total advantage of you? You know what? You're out there vulnerable, and they just took total advantage of you. What's the absolute worst? And then when oftentimes when I have done this, they'll tell me what they think the worst thing is, and I look them square in the eye and I say, and how likely do you think it is that this would happen? Actually happen? Because they go, they go full on everything, worst thing, apocalyptic. And I'm like, wow. And to your point, Chip, it's like you start to see where their head's at, and you're like, yeah, I'd be really scared of that too, if that's what was conjured up in my mind. So I think, okay, here's these crazy 3 people saying be vulnerable, and in my mind I'm thinking, Armageddon, right? It's like, yeah, that's hard to put together, but when you say it out loud and you're like, okay, how likely is that really to happen? Well, okay, maybe not total Armageddon, maybe here. And then really, you pull, it's like, oh, okay, maybe it's not quite as bad. And then what are the things we can work on to, so that it's a better place? I also think the last piece I'll throw in on this is, I think too, I communicate with Tom is, how can we, almost take I know it's going to sound weird, but a gratitude approach to this, which is to look at things. We all, as human beings, we do this too, is we find the things that support the internal narrative in our head, right? So if I think they're going to take advantage of me, if I'm vulnerable, I'm like, okay, I'm going to be vulnerable, but I know Catherine's going to, she's going to take advantage of me. I will look for the slightest thing that she does that seems to be taking advantage of me, and I'll be like, oh, see, there it is.
Yeah.
And I think part of it is to know that, okay, we do this. So how can I have a gratitude approach that says, you know what, I want to do this because I think we can be a better organization, and I want to pick out the ways that we are better when we do this. So you set the table for looking for those positive outcomes versus just setting a tone. You said it earlier, Chip, assume positive intent, right? But put it out there for yourself, even write it down. I want to look for the positives that come out of doing this. And then, Tom, maybe start with something small, right? And see if Armageddon happens or if some good stuff happens.
All right, got one more question for you guys. What are the measurable results you can attribute to trust and vulnerability inside an organization?
Mark,
Good
jump
question.
in. I'm not going to cut you off.
You're just taking advantage of me. I'm vulnerable.
I'm taking advantage of you
that
right
was
now.
Kevin saying, I don't want to take the first swing at this one.
Oh no, I'll certainly take the first swing at it.
No, you let me go first. Wait a second.
All right, you go.
Oh, I love this crew. I really do. No, I think that I think there's a lot of very measurable things that come out of courage and vulnerability and trust. I mean, it goes to what's our biggest in the vast majority of companies that we work with, members we have. The biggest expense in an organization you have is people, right? Now, some people might argue, okay, we've got a manufacturer or something, we might have a lot of product. Okay, I get it. But you know what? Then the second biggest thing is your people. And I think that, courage and vulnerability and, really showing up as a leader is you will get people. If you can get to a place where we're giving feedback, not criticism, right? Many of the things we've talked about through the hour today, you get people that are excited to come to work, that are excited to look for new opportunity. You don't have a lot of attrition. So what's a measurable one? It's your turnover rate. Mm-hmm. That's one simple one. And what does it cost us? I mean, there's how many different data points we have that, it costs 8-10 times somebody's salary to replace them, to find another one, to keep going through that. Turnover could be a simple one.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Catherine?
Yeah. So I think, something else, and I think we've all seen this, we have not brought up COVID one time this entire hour, but I'm fixing to do it. I'm about to do it.
That's it. We're done. Thank you very much. Everybody have a good day.
I know it. Here we go.
Come on.
Yeah, but I think, throughout this time, we have seen leaders either step up to the plate or bow out. And, I think the results of being vulnerable, results that you'll see of building trust with one another is when your leaders, when they show up, for their employees, when they're willing to do what they say they're going to do. And we've seen teams become much stronger throughout all of this, and we've seen teams, fall apart. And so, yes, turnover is one of them. You'll certainly see your communication increase, your communication get stronger with one another, and also just that bond that you have with your team. I think you'll really know who's got your back, and when leaders step up to the plate and take that charge, your team will follow. Your team will follow suit.
Yeah. I look at it more on a macro level. If you think about it, the companies that survive and sustain and thrive through any, decades, they're not volatile. The people inside of them, especially the leaders, are not volatile, because volatile leaders, those who are driven by ego and machismo and all those other things, that leadership style is not sustainable. Because what it does is it tempers your staff to it. And then when you really need them to listen to you, it's in one ear and out the other. But those companies who are built on a foundation of trust and vulnerability are significantly more sustainable than otherwise. Because, you look at what happens when we start coaching an organization, there's always that one that they've been afraid to get rid of because they think their impact is significant on the organization. Mm-hmm. And when we have to go through that piece of having that one person exit, the company thrives, even with lesser talent. Because when you look at engagement, when you look at the camaraderie, when you look at those relationships you build through having sound trust and sound vulnerability inside an organization, and really reserving those times, going back to feedback and criticism, I think it needs to be about 9 or 10 to 1 feedback, significantly more, and really reserve that criticism for when it's most needed. So
yeah, and I think on that too is that give feedback. I'd say never give criticism in public.
Yeah,
you want to talk about setting a negative tone for an organization, right? If you give criticism in public, you're communicating to everybody that's what we're going to do here, is we're going to criticize everybody. You don't have to get, the old saying is, give accolades in public and criticism in private. You don't have to give feedback in public necessarily. You can. But I think that criticism in private is important, right? To, say, hey, yeah, if we have to have a hard conversation, let's have a hard conversation, be vulnerable in leadership, right? In doing that, you have to have those. But that's not something that, we don't diffuse it by putting it in a public setting. That is not a good one. I also think, going with what you were saying, Chip, is, the best organizations are, business is Darwinian nature, right? It's not the strongest organizations that win. It's the organizations that adapt the best. And, from my perspective, from what I've seen in my career, in my companies, and in coaching businesses, is that, the ones that are flexible, right? The ones that adapt to things those are the ones that are more courageous, more vulnerable, or willing to see things, compassionately. Those are the ones that last, right? And succeed. So what's measurable? It shows up in the top line, the bottom line, and everything in between, if you're adapting.
Yep.
Yep.
We're up on the bottom of the hour. That went by.
Yeah.
They always go by fast.
And we only said COVID once. I love it.
One time.
56 minutes to get there. I love it.
It was great. So I'll hand it over to you. Just any last thoughts to wrap up, Catherine?
Yeah. So again, I will encourage everybody to be vulnerable. Do not see that as a weakness, because it's not a weakness. Um, it's really an asset of being creative. It's an asset for being innovative. We talked earlier, you begin to feel vulnerable when, there are times of uncertainty, when you're about to take a risk, when you're opening up, to that judgment of others. But when we fail, we learn. And, when we learn, we get better. And so the way to do that is to be vulnerable, take that risk. And also, the more open and honest you are with your team is exactly what they will also reciprocate. So build your foundation on that, and not necessarily the criticisms or the power plays that you think you have to do, because you don't. Mark?
Yeah. I think I do love that. I oftentimes say we're either winning or learning. There's no failing. The only time you fail is when you don't learn, right? But how do we make it so that we're in an environment where we're either winning or learning, right? I think that's that kind of, adaptability is important. I will encourage everybody, go out, get Brene Brown's book, Dare to Lead. Read that cover to cover about 28 times. I think it's a great, approach to leadership. And I'll kind of end on that. We're in a time where new approaches and new ways, people are open to them, right? We've all had our world shifted around in ways that we couldn't have ever anticipated or ever maybe wanted. But that means there's new ground opportunity now. As leaders, as businesses, there's never been a better opportunity to say, hey, here's a chance for us to think about how we've been doing things, and what if we went about it in a little different way? And courage and vulnerability. We heard those 3 crazy folks on Facebook talking about that. Maybe we'll try a little dabble of that and do that. So
Yeah.
Chip,
And
we'll end with you.
lastly, I'll say this. I think as an organization, we have to behave like the company we want to be way before things like our revenue says we are that company. And in order to do when you break that down, what it really means is, are we treating each other the right way? Are we having difficult conversations? Do we have trust that exists in our company? Do we have vulnerability across the board? Because it's the right thing to do. And those behaviors will springboard growth and change and a whole bunch of other things that are going to get you where you want to be. So if you think about it in the context, if you're a $2 million company now, start behaving like a $5 million company, and then you will be.
Mm-hmm.
And what's the difference? The reason you may have been stuck at being a $2 million company is because you're behaving like one. So get out of your comfort zone, take some of these things in, and go change. And then the trajectory of your business and the trajectory of yourself will grow and blossom as a result. So thanks everybody for joining us. You will be back up. This will be live on or back once we're done. It'll continue to be on Facebook. If you want to share it out, great. If not, you can also go to petrocoach.com and get a recap, as well as see the replay there. And then I'm not sure what our next date is.
It's not next week, but the following. So they happen every other Wednesday.
That'll be October the 7th at 1 p.m. Central. We'll be back here. You'll get some other faces, perhaps. Maybe Mark will join for a third time in a row. Who knows?
They don't want to see my face. Catherine's maybe, not mine.
I don't know.
I think also, encourage everybody to go to the petrocoach.com website and look at we've got tons of workshops and things, as we've all been going through this, one of the things that we believe strongly in at PetroCoach is that, we have access to resources and things that we know people can learn and grow from. Please come find that stuff. We talked about it earlier. When you don't like what you see or you're not acting like the organization you want to be, go seek out those resources. There's a ton here, and so much of it's for free. So it's all up to you. Take that risk, that first step. But check out our website and you can find those things.
Thank you all for joining.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thank you. Have a great